Thank you very much, everybody, for joining the webinar this afternoon. Great to see a number of people joining the call again. I'll tell you a little bit more about the session and the purpose in a moment, but just to introduce myself, I'm Michael Appleby. I'm the Managing Director at Altair Consulting, so I've got responsibility for a broad range of consulting services, including our regulation, governance, finance, treasury, transformation, and other work as well. I just want to say, really look forward to the session that we've got lined up this afternoon on the tenant satisfaction measures. We've got some great presentations coming up, some great external speakers, and I'm sure it'll be a thought-provoking, interesting and insightful session as well. I'm sure that everybody who's joined the call will be able to take a lot from it back into your organisations. So in terms of the purpose of the session, this is the fifth webinar, I think it is now, that we've run on the consumer standards over the last few months. And the background to it is, as we all know, the changes to proactive consumer regulation were implemented from the 1st of April for both local authorities and registered providers, and we're now starting to see the first planned inspections go through with various landlords. And this fifth webinar of the series has been put together really to give that focus of looking into each of the individual elements of the consumer standards. So we've been through in the other 4 webinars looking at each of the other elements. We've been really keen to put these webinars together to give that opportunity for a bit of a deeper dive review into the individual elements of the consumer standards, to kind of give a real kind of spotlight onto what they mean and how they can be acted on, and things that organisations should be thinking about. Really keen to hear from kind of experts in the sector, working and thinking through what the standards mean, to bring some real insights. And we've also been really keen to kind of look at kind of what the standards mean in terms of practical rather than just conceptual terms as well, with the ultimate aim of hopefully giving everybody who joins these webinars a bit more knowledge, a bit more insight, a bit of a better understanding as to what good looks like and what the options are for delivery going forward as well. So today, as I mentioned, we're going to focus on the tenant satisfaction measures, which have been around for some time, but kind of ramping up in importance. And it goes without saying how important not just the TSMs but the wider consumer standards are, and I'm sure it's still kind of top of the priority list for most organisations, boards, execs, and senior managers in the sector. So I'm sure the session today will help with some insight. So in terms of who we've got lined up and the kind of the structure of the session today, we've got 4 speakers lined up today. So Anne-Marie Bancroft, who's the Head of Consumer Regulation at Altair. She leads on our regulatory work. She is working with organisations preparing for when we're preparing for the implementation of the consumer standards. She works with organisations on customer engagement work and also helping with dealing with issues raised by the Housing Ombudsman as well. So she'll give a bit of a broad overview as to the wider regulatory environment that's in place at the moment. Delighted to welcome a few guest speakers as well. So we've got Fleur Stevens from the Regulator Social Housing. Fleur is the Head of Tenant Engagement at the Regulator, and she's been in role for around about 15 years, working at started at the Regulator in 2021, worked in housing for 15 years or so. Apologies, Fleur, including roles at the NHF and the CIH as well. Likewise, great to welcome Claire Wilde from the Regulator as well, Head of Policy Strategy and Impact. Claire's been working in housing for a number of years with a strong focus on policy and research as well, and also worked in a housing association as well. And finally, also great to welcome Adam Jewitt from Acuity Research as well. And Adam is currently working with a number of organisations at the moment on customer satisfaction, collecting data, supporting work on the tenant satisfaction measures, and we'll bring some real great insight into the data and the practical challenges of pulling the information together. So thank you very much upfront for all the speakers on preparation for the presentations and for their input into the session today. In terms of the agenda, we've got roughly 90 minutes set to one side for the webinar this afternoon. The presentation should take around 10, 15, 20 minutes each, and then we'll have time for questions and answers as well. So please do, and we're really keen for these sessions to be engaging, so please do, as you're listening to the presentations, log some questions. We'll come to them at the end as well, to have a bit of a discussion, a bit of a panel discussion at the end of the session as well. In terms of the 3 sessions, as I mentioned, Anne-Marie will kick us off in a moment with a broad overview of the current regulatory environment. Claire and Fleur will then be talking through the role of TSMs in that regulatory environment, some of the things that they're seeing, and then I'm going to share some insights on learning so far and some of the insights into the data as well. In terms of the practical arrangements, I've mentioned kind of questions. We're recording the webinar, so if you do need to drop off, and you can pick it up at another time, or if you find the content of the webinar is interesting, then please do pass it on to colleagues. In terms of questions and answers, we'll be sharing some contact details after the webinar as well, and that's particularly if you've got any technical or specific or quite detailed questions in terms of the management of the TSMs that we can't quite get into in the detail of this in this webinar. We'll probably keep it at a slightly broader level, but there'll be some contact details for you to follow up on with the regulator. Okay, I think that probably covers off the overview, so I will pass over to Anne-Marie, who will talk through the overview of the regulatory changes. Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thanks, Michael. Yes, so I'm going to run through just a really high-level overview of what's changed from a regulatory perspective. I think it's useful to provide the context to our discussion. So the initial change to the sector has come about following the identification of systemic issues resulting from found from the management of high-rise buildings and through learnings post Grenfell, really. There is also broader concerns about the treatment of social housing tenants and the quality of social housing across the sector. Now, government's responded in a range of mechanisms. It's not a singular response. It's a multifaceted response of which seeks to overcome that systemic failure. Now, there are three key areas that touch tenants that really have resulted in change. So starting with the Housing Ombudsman Service, we saw changes to the Housing Ombudsman Service really early. And for that reason, we've seen quite a lot of conversation about the Housing Ombudsman Service and their role recently. And they were given a statutory complaints code. They were able to issue a complaints code a good while back, but the statutory complaints code is now statutory as of 1st of April. They've also got the ability to issue complaint handling failure orders and conduct systemic and thematic investigations. And now there's the assessment of compliance with the complaints handling code by returns, which will align with the returns for the TSMs on the 30th of June. So we've seen a strengthened Housing Ombudsman Service. In addition, there is a new building safety regulator that sits within the Health and Safety Executive. Now, I'm not focusing too much on all of the range of mechanisms that are in place for the building safety regulator, because that in itself is a webinar. But for those key tenant touching areas are about mandatory engagement plans for high-rise blocks and for residents to have a say about the decisions about their homes that affect the safety. We've also seen good practice with the Building Safety Charter, of which quite a lot of providers and suppliers have signed up to across the sector. But today we discuss proactive consumer regulation, which comes with a range of mechanisms, the new consumer standards, the tenant satisfaction and management information. I'll share exactly what the difference between the two. Higher self-referral expectations, arguably higher self-referral expectations for consumer matters, and inspections that replace IDAs. As well, we see professionalisation of the social housing sector, of which is closed for consultation, but we'll be expecting to see something in relation to that by April 2025. There's also tenant training that was launched, but we've not really seen a huge movement in that area, together with Tenants, which was from the National Housing Federation and the National Housing Federation Code of Governance. All of these mechanisms work together to be able to address that systemic issue, or those systemic issues that we've identified as a sector. Nonetheless, no regulatory environment alone can achieve complete change. It ultimately does sit with providers to buy into the change and the culture change and the way that we should improve tenants' experience of landlords, to actually instigate what's being attempted through government. So we've seen revised consumer standards, and the revised consumer standards, originally we had the 4 standards, and we've had them since 2012. They've now officially been revised and are active from the 1st of April. So we've seen the home standard change to safety and quality standard. Title alone tells us the purpose and change and the focus in that area about the safety and quality of homes. And the tenant involvement and empowerment standard being changed to the transparency, influence and accountability standard. Now that now encompasses, so we did have a period of time where we had a tenant satisfaction measures standard, but the tenant involvement and empowerment standard now encompasses the tenant satisfaction measures expectations and the requirements amongst them. Fleur and Claire will talk a little bit more around that. The neighbourhood and community standard has stayed as it is, and same for the tenancy standard, but we can expect or should expect a competence and conduct standard come April next year. So that's our revised consumer standards. Organisations have now got to meet these expectations. The transparency, influence and accountability standard provides a real clarity in relation to self-referral, of which organisations should be engaging actively with the regulator for instances where they feel they don't comply with the consumer standards, which is a real change. Nonetheless, the key to all of this change is the regulator's ability to intervene on consumer matters, of which we were waiting for the Social Housing Regulation Act for. So the tenant satisfaction measures, not as mentioned, not a standalone standard anymore, but the technical requirements sit under the transparency, influence and accountability standard. There is a range of technical guidance and information available to providers to not only collect the right information, but also report it. And the tenant satisfaction measures in the technical requirements cover how to report, what relevant housing stock is involved, the responsibility for accuracy, the tenant perception measures, and then the TSMs that are generated from management information. Tenant satisfaction measures alone for organisations that have a multifaceted stock base might not directly correlate with organisational KPIs. It's really important to note, because there might be 2 sets of reporting for certain organisations. One that's KPI reporting covering all stock within the site of the board, and then the other being the tenant satisfaction measures. So it's something always that I imagine the sector's working quite hard with, to engage with leadership and boards to explain the slight differences. It's only what's within the scope of the RSH that is reported through the TSMs. I'll give a quick summary of the TSMs and then I'll pass over to Claire and Fleur. There are 2 sets of measures. You've got tenant satisfaction measures, which are collected from tenant perception surveys. What do your tenants think of you as a landlord? And then TSMs that are generated from management information that should be available to landlords to be able to provide directly to the regulator. When we talk about TSMs, we generally talk about both, but during this webinar, we'll make sure if we're focusing on one or the other, we'll highlight that. The TSMs in themselves provide a whole range of information. We've all had discussions about whether we'd see league tables from TSMs. I anticipate it may happen through Inside Housing. It's not that the regulator will release them, but the TSMs provide a broad picture of what that a housing service and landlord service may look like, both through the eyes of tenants and what's actually being delivered from a management mechanism perspective. We'll discuss during this webinar little elements of the TSMs that cross-cut and how to triangulate and use information from TSMs to really understand what's happening within an organisation and what your tenant's experience is. So I'll now pass on to Claire, and she speaks first, and then Fleur.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Thanks very much. And thanks to Altair for inviting Fleur and I. As Michael said, I'm Claire Wilde. I'm head of policy, strategy and impact at the regulator, and I was involved in the development of the tenant satisfaction measures with our business intelligence team, who worked on the sort of more technical side. So next slide, please. Thank you. So I think I just wanted to talk through a bit about sort of the context really, and this really sort of follows very much on from Anne-Marie's slides. Socialising tenants' homes should be safe and well maintained, and landlords should deliver effective landlord services, and that's very much the sort of forms the basis and the focus of the new consumer standards. And tenants should be able to hold their landlords to account for the delivery of those services. And it's our job to ensure that landlords are delivering what tenants need and what's in the standards. As Michael said, so from April last year, all providers must collect and publish the data in line with our requirements. And on the 1st of April this year, we introduced our new approach to consumer regulation. So the deadline for the submission of TSM's tenant satisfaction measure data of the first year is the end of June, and we have already had a small number of submissions in. So the end of June for large providers to submit to us. Landlords should also be publishing their TSM data in a timely manner. I think there might be I've heard a bit of misunderstanding about that we've specified a particular time or a period in which providers should, we say, in a timely manner in the standards, and we would expect that that's something that you perhaps agree with your own tenants about when they want to see that data. And Fleur will talk a little bit later about looking ahead in terms of the TSMs, and also about, as Anne-Marie said, about how we will use that data. And we've started inspecting large landlords, so seeking evidence of assurance that they're delivering the outcomes of the new consumer standards. So I think we're, as a regulator, really pleased to sort of that launch of that new regulatory regime has begun. Next slide, please. Thank you. This slide very much sort of invites us all to take a bit of a step back, really, in terms of looking at the tenant satisfaction measures in the context of our wider role and approach. And we've reconfirmed, if you like, these principles that we work to in the recent publication of Regulating the Standards. So we regulate at a landlord level to see how well the landlord's delivering the outcomes. We think that's what works best for driving improvement across the sector and within landlords. We, in terms of co-regulatory, where sort of boards and councillors continue to be responsible for their organisations and are accountable for how they're run and the outcomes that they're required to deliver. In terms of us being risk-based, when we're talking about risk, we consider risks that apply, as you would imagine, to a range of different factors, to groups of landlords, individual landlords. We're particularly concerned about risks that might threaten areas like the safety and quality of tenants' home, the financial viability of a landlord, how well governed they are, how they manage risk, transparency and accountability to tenants. And really, those areas are particular areas that we may look to seek assurance in more detail on in terms of landlords delivering on those particular outcomes in our standards. We may also consider landlords who present a higher risk, who might carry out activities that are have a more inherent risk within them, or perhaps some more novel activities that need to be well managed in order for the landlord to remain financially viable. We may also consider risks where the sort of a potential higher risk to a larger group of tenants or to more vulnerable tenants, or risks that are likely to put tenants' health and safety at risk. In terms of being assurance-based, and you'll see that a lot through our new Regulating the Standards, we talk a lot about we're seeking evidence that gives us assurance. And so we're looking at relevant evidence from the landlord and looking at evidence from other sources as well, to try and show us how, how they're delivering and how well they're delivering the outcomes of the standards. And that's where we may follow up with a landlord where we think there are gaps in that assurance, or where there's conflicting evidence, and we come to a view about the level of assurance that we have about landlord's delivery and whether we think that is sufficient for us. And very much, and you'll see this throughout a number of our slides, we focus on the delivery of outcomes. And when we talk about the outcomes, we mean both the required outcomes and the specific expectations in our standards. And we're very much an outcomes-focused regulator. We think it's for landlords to decide how to deliver their services in the way that's appropriate for their tenants and for their organisation. could move the slide on, thank you. So as Anne-Marie's said, we have our 4 new standards which apply to all landlords, and as I've said, they're outcome-based standards, so landlords can deliver the outcomes we expect. And you will see, although it's not mentioned on here, we have the new Consumer Code of Practice, which I would also encourage people to look at and to review. It's very much a document that aims to provide examples of where we what we would be expecting to see, or what we think, what we might see, what we might consider to be an acceptable way of delivering the standards. So I think it's a really useful document for people to sort of bring it to life, if you like, in terms of some of the examples we give. As Anne-Marie said, the TSM requirements have been incorporated into the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard, and they remain exactly the same. They were literally just sort of lifted over and incorporated in. Albeit there are some, it's within a sort of wider set of requirements around performance information. And also I think it's worth pointing out in that code of practice there's some additional information around sort of how we would expect providers to, with the considerations we would expect providers to give to when they're publishing their data. So it talks about publishing it at different levels, at different levels of granularity, in agreement with tenants. And just on the last couple of points, so boards and councillors having robust mechanisms, it's very much up for the organisations to ensure that their boards and councillors have that assurance, and that they can be provided with assurance that their organisation is delivering the outcomes of all the standards. Obviously here we're talking specifically about the tenant satisfaction measure requirements, and that they have that assurance that that the TSM data that's being produced is timely and accurate and robust. And then it's for landlords to show us with evidence how they're delivering those outcomes. So I will now pass you on to my colleague Fleur, who will carry on talking about the measures and how we're using them to inform our regulation.
Thanks, Claire. So as I think we've mentioned this session, we're not going to be going into the details of the TSM requirements, but I thought this slide would be a helpful reminder of where you can find more detailed guidance. In particular, if we think about the technical requirements and the tenant survey requirements, they're particularly sort of documents of note, because they'll form the basis for the review that the regulator will conduct on TSM submissions. These are, they're the things that we'll be checking against. The frequently asked questions document is useful. It covers follow-up questions that we've had since the publication of our guidance, kind of bringing to the fore or making clearer some quite specific questions that we've been asked. And then the last one here is the guidance notes for how to submit TSM data via the NWASH Plus site. And that guidance is hosted on the NWASH Plus site itself, whereas the others are on our website. As Claire mentioned, the deadline for submission for the TSM data is the end of June. So if, having read this guidance, you still have questions, you still have concerns, I would really urge you to contact us as soon as possible, and we'll circulate contact details that you can use tomorrow. I think it will come out with the recording of this webinar. Can I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So the regulator has set the requirements for the TSMs based on, as we know, the white paper and what was extensive consultation with tenants, both in the production of the white paper, but prior to launching the consultation for the TSMs and the consultation for the TSMs. And at a macro level, the regulator has committed to publishing the TSMs. And when we do that, we'll be thinking about the overall picture of the sector with a real focus on data quality, as well as perhaps any trends or patterns in the broadest sense. For individual providers, the regulator does have a role, which I mentioned, in checking that our requirements have been met. It's really important to understand that the TSMs are obviously at their core landlords' data being provided to tenants so that tenants can hold their landlord to account. And strongly linking in with our co-regulatory approach, the idea is that tenants are armed with this information, the regulator will oversee the process, the landlords will provide the data. In particular, providers should be considering what their TSM results are telling them about how they are delivering the outcomes of our wider consumer standards. So thinking back to Claire's second slide about delivering the outcomes of our standards. So how do the results of your TSMs, when read together, perhaps with other performance information, how does that shed new light on areas? So for example, what is the performance information, the management data saying on safety and quality, and how does that match with tenant perceptions of safety and quality? And if there is a mismatch there, or if there's something of note, what might be needed in that space is a key consideration for boards and councillors. Similarly, thinking about complaints data or ASB data, or even repairs, there are all satisfaction rates linked to those performance measures. And how do the tenant scores for how they feel about that service provision match what you consider to be your service provision? And importantly, things like how do tenants rate feeling like their provider listens to and acts on their feedback? How does that relate to things like the tenant engagement opportunities you have available? If you think you've got really great tenant engagement opportunities available, but tenants are telling you that they don't feel listened to or heard, there might be some work in that space thinking about the outcomes under the transparency, influence and accountability standard. And then also thinking about what are the differences between cohorts of tenants or populations of tenants. Do tenants living in on-street properties have notably different levels of satisfaction to tenants living in high-rise residential buildings? All of those things we would be looking, we'd be wanting providers to consider what their TSM data is telling them about their services. And obviously, as I've mentioned, the TSMs are not the only performance information or survey data that we would expect providers to be using and publishing for tenants. Key considerations for landlords about the TSMs will be things like what is in place to make sure that boards or councillors have got assurance that the TSM requirements are being followed. So how have you considered the representativeness of the sample compared to your overall population of tenants? And do you have assurance that that is an accurate reflection? What assurance is there around things like the robustness and comparability of survey data and the management information as well? More obvious checks is the survey data from a perception-based survey rather than a transactional survey. Were the wording and the response scales that we set out in our requirements, were they the right ones that were used in the tenant satisfaction measure survey that was used with tenants? And these are all things that we're likely to be looking at as part of our analysis of TSM data submissions. And then the last thing on this slide is, how is the TSM data being made available to tenants? And how does that fit with our other required outcomes in the consumer standards around clear, transparent, accessible and timely publication of information for tenants? So really thinking about not just the TSMs as a standalone thing, but what else can you use them for in terms of the new consumer standards and new approach to regulation? Next slide, please. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that in between carrying out our programmed inspections, the regulator does review a range of information from landlords, and the tenant satisfaction measures will come into that review. On data quality issues, we will follow up when we see issues around data quality. When landlords submit their TSMs and supporting documents via NROS+, there is an option to declare if you think or know that you haven't met the requirements that we've set out in terms of the TSMs. And we would absolutely encourage you to be transparent and really just reiterate that it is better to tell us, as we will be looking at responses in detail and following up on those data quality issues. So if you suspect or know that you haven't been able to meet our requirements, there is an option on NROS+ for you to let us know from the outset that that is your concern. And then also just obviously, please make sure that you submit your TSMs on time and that you send us the right things. And then importantly on risk, I think Claire has covered this, but if we receive data that suggests that a landlord is at risk of failing to deliver the outcomes of our standards, we will carry out further assessment and specifically in areas that present a risk of harm to tenants. So thinking about the safety and quality aspects. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide from us, and it's just a look ahead. So we have the period of TSM data cleaning and analysis, which will take place internally in the regulator over the summer months. We'll then publish the TSM data in the autumn, as mentioned earlier. Where we receive new directions from the department, we will update or add new TSMs, for example, on electrical safety that was in the white paper. The small provider TSM data submission pilot, this is ongoing, and our business intelligence team has asked us to pass on thanks to anyone on the call who is taking part in that. You will have noticed as well, the regulator is doing their own national tenant survey, which is a one-off tenant survey, in addition to the TSMs, using the same questions as the TSMs to give us that sort of robust and independent benchmark for landlords' TSM results. And also to provide more detail about differing levels of satisfaction among different groups of tenants. And the data collection for that is ongoing. And then finally, in the longer term, a review of the TSMs. We've been clear from the outset that we will review the TSMs in due course. And I think once we've got sufficient data and insight, we've absolutely left the door open for that review to take place. So that's it from us. And I think we're going to take questions at the end.
Thanks, Fleur. I think we're on to Adam now. Could just flick the slides.
Hello, thank you very much. Yes, so hello everyone, and first of all, thank you to Claire and Fleur for that really helpful and illuminating presentation on the direction and outcomes of the TSMs. I know it's really helpful to hear some of the points you mentioned. As Michael mentioned, of course, I'm Adam Jewitt, and I am a client manager at Acuity. So we are a market research agency who specialise in the social housing sector. And we've been undertaking the perception survey element of the TSMs throughout the year. So I suppose my talk today, I wanted to be more of a reflection of what we've been seeing so far last year, 2023-24, as well as some thoughts for the year ahead and how we could optimise those TSM surveys. So it's going to be a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, and there'll be some aspects of the TSMs that I will pass over. So do forgive me for steaming on ahead. But with that in mind, can we have the next slide, please? Perfect. So I just want to start with a brief outline of Acuity. So we've been running satisfaction surveys for over 25 years. Of course, this year, a large part of that has been towards the TSM surveys, which we've done for a number of landlords, both large landlords, 30, 40,000, and smaller landlords, so those with fewer than 1,000 properties. And these span across the breadth of England. So yes, we also undertake a range of transactional surveys for our clients. That will include ASB, repairs, complaints, planned maintenance, etc., as well as staff surveys and profiling EDI surveys, which we've actually seen become more popular this year, especially in light of the TSMs, which I think illuminated for many landlords the need to perhaps understand their tenants better. So to undertake these, we use a range of methodologies. So it's largely telephone, using our team of 95 plus interviewers, postal surveys, and we also do online surveys. So as I mentioned, just use today to put what we are seeing into context. So we want to look at those strong and poor performance indicators, and also like to touch upon a small complaints pilot that we did this year, just to understand around complaints handling slightly more. So if we have the next slide, please. Wonderful. So I think when we consider the results that we've been seeing, it's absolutely essential that we consider the national context and the external factors which are pushing satisfaction generally downwards. We need essentially to understand the context in which we're operating. So generally, and this is something we've seen consistently sometime, it predates COVID, satisfaction has been falling for social landlords. Now, we all know the challenges that landlords have been facing. So we have financial squeezes, recruitment issues, increased operating costs. But I think there's also been those challenges for tenants, which also influence this, not least the cost of living challenges and the crisis. Perhaps also there may have been a change in expectation of what a landlord is. and what a landlord should provide for tenants as a result of increased scrutiny. So if you just click one ahead, there should be a table come up there. Wonderful. So the table here shows overall satisfaction for LCRA clients in Q1 to Q3. And this includes both tracker and those annual surveys. Q4 data is coming up, and we will share this with our clients later on this month, I believe. So yes, looking at this table, important again to see the results in context. Size and geography are very crucial indicators of where satisfaction is. As you can see here, the London median percentage for satisfaction is 65%, which is far lower than the general median of 73%. I think this should perhaps inform our expectations of what we could realistically expect. For our London landlords, for instance, it may be worthwhile to target the 25th percentile, whereas for smaller landlords who generally draw higher levels of satisfaction, perhaps that 75th percentile is a more realistic aim. If I could have the next slide, please. Wonderful. So I want to just push on ahead to the 3 key communications and engagement metrics. Listen to Nats, kept informed, and treat fairly and with respect. So for me, I think these play a crucial role in shaping tenant perception and hence satisfaction, as these are fundamentally perception surveys. I think they also play a key role in shaping satisfaction in other service areas, for instance, repairs and complaints. So to start with, how satisfied or dissatisfied are you that your landlord listens to your views and acts upon them? This tends to be one of the lower performing metrics in the surveys. It tends to sit alongside ASB handling and complaints handling. And it's a difficult one, I think, perhaps to understand because it can be linked to last contact. It could also be perhaps linked to a last contact perhaps a year or so ago. Also, high expectations. What do tenants expect of their landlords when it comes to listening and acting? And this might perhaps be different from tenant to tenant. It's often tied as well, I think, to not getting a resolution, particularly in terms of repairs and complaints. So I think for this metric, particularly to understand how we can improve it, we need to first understand and place crucial focus on what it means to tenants. The next metric is tenants being kept informed about things that matter to them. Of course, again, this is about perception. So how do tenants want to be kept informed? By what medium? Is this easily accessible to tenants? Is it easy to find, easy to understand? These are key essential factors which influence this metric, and it's ones which perhaps it's easy to overlook, but it's very important, of course. Treat fairly and with respect. So this often tends to be, as with kept informed, one of the higher performing metrics in the survey. As you can see there, with a median percentage of 75%. And for these, there is often a high percentage of neither satisfied nor dissatisfied, despite having a don't know, not applicable option, which is, of course, removed from the base when we calculate these scores. If I could have the next slide, please. Effective handling of complaints. So yes, this tends to raise the most eyebrows for our clients, and that's often due to the low satisfaction that it typically draws. As you can see here, with a median satisfaction of 34%. Generally, we see it is quite common that dissatisfaction outweighs satisfaction, and that is a concerning prospect, of course. The question itself is preceded by a pre-qualifier question. So it asks tenants, have you made a complaint in the last 12 months? Only those who answer yes or ask a follow-up question on complaints handling. And we can have typically anywhere between 15 and 35% of tenants saying that they have made a complaint in the last 12 months. And this doesn't always correspond to the number of complaints we have logged on, for instance, on our softwares. So it can be quite an eyebrow-raising statistic, one which is difficult to cross-match. But again, I think it comes back to perception and how tenants perceive what a complaint is, and that in reality is the most important thing here. So this number comprises more than just those formal complaints. It also includes, for instance, service requests. And that's difficult to draw out and isolate from the TSM data itself, I think. If we move on to the next slide, please. So in Q4 last year, we undertook a small complaints pilot study. So these were at the end of the complaints questions for a number of our landlords. And this data that we have here is based on around 1,000 telephone calls which were made in January 2024. So what we use this complaints pilot to do was to understand a little bit more about the complaints that tenants were referring to, how they were made, how they were resolved, and not least how we can improve complaints handling in future. So as for the reasons which tenants gave for their scores, it was largely to do with the fact that the complaint hadn't been resolved, or that, for instance, it may not have been the resolution that tenants wanted. Following this was the actual handling of the complaint, and then the time taken either to respond to the complaint or to resolve that complaint. The reason for complaint, well, this goes over a number of different kind of areas as we expect, but the most popular reasons were repairs at 24% and ASB cases at 22%. 40% use multiple channels to report their complaint, the most common being telephone calls into the contact centre. Of those who said that they had reported a complaint, only 38% of those had been resolved. Only a quarter of those were formal complaints which the tenant understood to have gone through the stage 1 and stage 2 process. 73% of those were unsure about the stage reached. So there's a question here around awareness. In terms of improving service and complaints handling, almost half spoke about improving communication. Residents also wanted landlords to be more proactive in resolving complaints. So for us, the main key findings from this was around awareness. So increasing awareness of how to make a complaint, making sure that that's accessible, making sure that tenants know how they can make a complaint and that they are able to do it. And finally, how we communicate with our tenants. So if we move on, thank you. So one interesting insight, I think, for me to come out this year was the existence of a survey method bias. So generally, those who undertake the survey online report lower satisfaction than those who undertake the survey by other means, for instance, telephone or postal surveys. So as you can see here, this is for one client, the difference in satisfaction between online and telephone surveys. Do forgive me, however, for the slight error on the bottom there, where the base sizes are indeed incorrect. So these scores here consist of around 1,200 surveys conducted by telephone and around 400 conducted online. So as you can see here, this can be quite stark for some landlords. This is not universal. For some landlords, there may be very little bias. However, for others, there are significant differences. And so why is this? Well, it's difficult to pinpoint exactly. Perhaps maybe the age of respondents who use the online method. I think we could all agree perhaps younger residents tend to respond more online than older tenants, and they tend to be less satisfied in the majority of cases. Also, perhaps the format. Perhaps it's easier to complain online over telephone or speaking to someone face to face. Of course, with this in mind, it's not necessarily to suggest that we need to exclude and remove online surveys entirely. That is not what we want, as these are definitely a viable opportunity, particularly for younger residents, to participate in these surveys. And so what can we do? Well, we tend to, for our clients, we tend to limit the online surveys either to as much as 20%. Often we also tend to dig deep into the data files, into the resident data, and to see who may prefer, for instance, an online survey. Also, some landlords have included additional questions at the end of their surveys, asking tenants what preferred method they would like to complete their next survey, which would use, of course, to inform the methodology that we use. If we can move on, please. Thank you. So just wanted to touch upon one more point here. So this is, why is satisfaction falling? Of course, the cost of living crisis may play quite a key role in influencing why satisfaction has been reducing in recent years. At the end of the day, these are perception surveys, and the answers do reflect how residents feel and how they see the world. So satisfaction, indeed, is impacted more by more than just the services that we deliver. So what we did to try and give this context was we included an additional question at the end of some surveys, which asked residents, are you concerned about the cost of living crisis in general? And what we did for these clients at the end of this, we compared those who said that they were very concerned and those who said that they were not at all concerned by the cost of living to the satisfaction levels, scores that they gave according to each metric. As we can see here, it tends to be that those who are not at all concerned with the cost of living crisis tend to report higher satisfaction than those who are very concerned. So of course here for these results, 84% of those who responded said that they were concerned. 8% were not at all concerned, with the remaining who would prefer not to say. So the difference here between those who are worried and not worried was an average 19 percentage points in terms of the difference in satisfaction there. And I must reiterate again that this number and this picture will be different for different landlords. For instance, not everyone will have 84% of tenants concerned about the cost of living, and not every landlord will see as stark differences as these. Can we move on, please? Thank you very much. So just to sum up, a couple more slides here. So on next steps. How can we use these findings moving forward? Well, first of all, we need to understand and we need to use the findings in an effective way. So customer recovery. I assume that many of you will have run entirely confidential surveys. Others, clients of ours, have asked a couple of permission questions at the end of their surveys. Are you happy to be identified when we pass your results back to your landlord? And second of all, are you happy to be contacted to discuss any issues raised? For those who have asked such permission questions, it's absolutely important, if resources allow, that we do try and recontact customers to demonstrate, if not for anything else, that we are listening and acting, and to really push upon resolving any issues that are outstanding. We also need to analyse our results and understand the contextual, the methodological, and the performance variables. So do we understand, for instance, the difference and the impact that location has on our results? To understand the impact that age has. In terms of methodology, of course, each has its pros and its cons. And in terms of performance, so what are the key indicators that have the biggest impact on satisfaction overall and in general across each metrics? We also need to review the results, of course, with everyone, and that includes staff, tenants, engaged tenants and board, and we need to draw action plans for improvement. We need to report those tenants, TSM results to tenants, of course, as well. We need to get the survey methodology right. So if we have had low response rates, can we identify those non-respondents? Do we know who those respondents are, and how can we adapt our approach so that we can raise the opportunity, increase the opportunity to gather as much of these unheard voices as we can? We also need to optimize our next survey. So are we including probes and open-ended questions that will allow us to maximize the opportunity that the TSM surveys present? Are we asking additional questions that will add maximum insight? Are we maximizing the insight that we can gather from these surveys? Finally, get to know your tenants. As I mentioned earlier, we have seen a rise in EDI and profiling surveys recently. I think this has come about from the TSM surveys, which have highlighted that perhaps more needs to be done to understand our tenants. And finally, we need to change perception. So just the final slide, please, which will be the next one. Wonderful. So I'm aware that I've been speaking for quite some time now. So I'd just like to leave you with one more kind of note or idea. So I think when we consider moving forward, we consider our TSM results. We need to consider two perspectives. Traditionally, we tend to consider results from a lens of providers. So we think about the quality of service. We think about TSM results, satisfaction, performance, the services we are providing. Of course, this is really important, but I think we need to balance this and look as well at satisfaction and the TSMs through the lens of the tenant. So in terms of perception, how do they perceive certain things? Are services accessible? We can't deliver an effective housing service if it is not accessible to tenants. So we need to understand tenants' needs. We also need to understand how we communicate with tenants, which is key, of course. And so what use, yes, is a quality service if tenants cannot easily access it, if it's not perceived in the right way. And there are many things I think to think about as we move forward into the year ahead in terms of delivering those effective landlord services. And next slide. Thank you. So yes, that is the presentation. Thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, Anne-Marie, Fleur and Claire as well. Some really excellent presentations there. And I'm sure I've got everybody thinking and give some real kind of insight and some thoughts. So please do, as I mentioned at the start, submit some questions if you've got questions. We've got a couple of questions come through, which I'll kick off with in a moment. I've got a few questions myself, but please do log them in the Q&A box on the bottom of the screen, and I'll pitch them to the panel as we come through. But from my point of view, some really useful reminders in there through all three presentations around, and Adam picked up on it again on the end, and I think Fleur mentioned it around, particularly in the TSMs. This is about enabling customers and tenants to scrutinise the performance of the organisation as much as it is the regulator. It's about that engagement with residents as it is the regulator. And I think sometimes the debate sometimes shifts a bit more towards, well, we've got to provide it for the regulator. Well, no, it's about it for the tenants. And likewise, some useful points there around, I think, Fleur, again, in your presentation around the importance of not just looking at the outputs of what the satisfaction measures are showing, but trying to dive into that and drive kind of the linkages between the two, link it back to real life experience, other initiatives that are going on, and that kind of process. And ask you a couple of questions no doubt about that in a moment. One question that's come through, and it's probably Adam and Anne-Marie to kind of kick us off, maybe Adam, just as around how we can best kind of engage with customers, with residents, to get their input into surveys. I think some of the sector often kind of struggle to get good response levels, struggle to get good input. Adam, and then maybe Anne-Marie, any advice on kind of that engagement and increasing that participation?
Well, yes, I mean, I think we have seen response rates dwindle this year, particularly for postal returns. And I think this is, of course, a worry as well particularly for smaller landlords as they move ahead. For instance, dwindling response rates, dwindling returns, especially if they opt to undertake an annual survey. In terms of how we best engage tenants, there have been a number of different methods. I mean, I think it's all about how we use these TSM results now. How do we demonstrate to our tenants that these are having a purposeful and effective effect? And I think at the end of the day, that is going to drum up engagement, to know that real improvements are being made. Are we engaging with our staff, our frontline staff as well, to promote that survey? They are an important important frontline action to increase an engagement there. Yes, this is, I don't know, Anne-Marie, if you have any further points to add.
Adam's point about how we use this series of TSM results or general survey results, be that transactional or through the TSMs, to communicate how the changes are being done. I think apathy generally comes from when it feels like what's the difference in me making this response? So I think there's a relationship thing, and I think providers really struggle to actually communicate the outcomes of changes made on the back of surveys, changes made as a result of tenant engagement to the tenants, but being able to deliver how that tenant or that individual has driven change and improved things for other tenants will only help them engage further. I think it's about making sure that the tenants feel like they're making a difference by making a response. If it feels like nothing happens, then they'll not bother to reply.
I think again as well, I touched upon customer recovery. If you have included those permission questions and you do have permission to recontact residents to discuss any issues they've raised, that's a really important way of demonstrating that you are listening and acting, that the TSM is not just a box ticking exercise, that it does have real outputs. And I think if you do have the opportunity, it's definitely a route to take if resources allow, of course.
I think if I could just add to that. So over the last 3 years, I've done some quite extensive engagement with tenants about surveys and how we should check that landlords are meeting our standards. And what I hear consistently from tenant groups is a real dislike of transactional surveys. So I think this question was specifically about transactional surveys, and the feedback I've heard from tenants, albeit anecdotal but quite widespread, was we get a repair done and we're asked to rank it out of 5 and we just press 5, because if you press 2 or 1, the landlord will phone you the next day and ask you what happened. And I don't have time for that. We don't have time for that. And I think, every time you use a service, every time you get something delivered, or, you're shopping a parcel, they'll ask you, how was it? How was the delivery service? And it can feel exhausting and overwhelming. So I think using transactional surveys certainly have a place, but really consider the tenant's perspective in completing that survey. Who does it? When do they do it? How do they fill it out? How's that data used? And as you said, how do tenants hear that data is being used? What changes are made because of it?
I think also, which Adam, I think you touched upon in your slide, was that this speaks to the point around survey methodology as well to some extent. And I think one of the reasons why, and I know that the next question also sort of touches upon this potential sort of survey bias and survey methodology, is that one of the reasons why we didn't specify a particular survey methodology is sort of, it relates to this point around meeting tenants' needs and using methodologies that suit your tenants and allowing landlords to have that freedom to use potentially a range of methods. So it could be, and this is amongst many other considerations, it could be that actually the methodology that you're settling on may be, may seem a sort of easier option, but it may be something that's actually putting barriers in the way of tenants to respond to the survey.
Yeah, it's a really good point around kind of that survey bias, which I was going to come on to. But yeah, the leadership point about kind of demonstrating action on the back of surveys, but also Fleur, your point around kind of tackling kind of survey fatigue. We all experience it, don't we? And exactly the same way that customers for housing and local authorities will do as well. The survey bias point was really fascinating in your slide, Adam. I wrote down some of the differences: 28% difference between online and telephone on being kept informed, 20% on safe and home. And I think one of the questions is around, are we really surprised by it? Of course, it's going to be easier to find more negative feedback online, isn't it? But then we've got to reflect the fact that different types of different customers or different generations have got different approaches. I was just thinking from regulators' point of view, because there's often this kind of discussion around kind of potential for gaming satisfaction results, and if you kind of lean more towards one survey methodology than another, you might get better results. You can see the figures are quite stark there. Is that something that you would look at in terms of the methodology of the survey and where the responses have come from and what's gone into it, and then maybe come to Adam on how we might be able to avoid some of those biases? Claire?
I mean, we're very alive to that, and you can see in both the consultation document where we talked at quite bit of length about the survey methodology issue and the sort of on balance we felt giving the flexibility to landlords sort of overrode that risk of sort of survey bias. But it is quite a fine line, and it's something we engaged with before the consultation. And although we did get support for that particular decision, we are going to use things like the National Tenant Survey in particular to look at that for ourselves, because I think although we were aware of evidence around survey bias, we want to see that both from providers and from our own data. But it is something we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at, alongside the perception measures data, providers need to submit a summary of the requirements and how they've met the requirements, and we would expect to see within that what methods they've used, so it's quite transparent to tenants to see how the difference that it makes. So we will be looking in, and I think those documents, that part of the publication is really important to tenants, albeit there might be quite a lot of data and quite a lot of information in there, but it's going to set the context, I think, for the providers, for the landlords' data.
Fine. And Adam, any thoughts on kind of how to mitigate against the risks of survey bias in terms of kind of sample size is the wrong term, but makeup of different types of surveys? Do you go for certain segments, or do you link it to the customer profiling information? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, from a simple perspective, a simple way of going about it would be to limit the, for instance, online responses to 20% and perhaps 80% telephone, and make sure that those online surveys are targeting, for instance, younger tenants. Have we asked this information before as well? So, as I mentioned in my talk, perhaps we can ask an additional question at the end of the survey. How would you like to be contacted? I think for most people, it's difficult to avoid some level of survey method bias. For some other landlords, it might not be apparent for whatever reason, but it's definitely something that we need to consider, of course, moving forward. Is there a way that we can, for instance, do a deep dive into the tenant data to see who might be a more viable recipient of an online survey? But again, I think the focus needs to be on giving tenants maximum opportunity to participate in a survey, and that should be, for instance, the thinking moving forward, I think.
Yeah. Sticking with you, Adam, one of the things that I often see with satisfaction data, performance data, is that, we'll call it again, that London bias, with lower levels of performance in London. Just wondered if you got any insights into what's driving that, and is it unique to London, or do we see it in other large metropolitan cities as well, or is it a London factor by itself? I just wonder if you could expand on that a bit more.
Yes, well, I mean, I think it's from what I've seen, it's London in general. We yet to look at perhaps the other large metropolitan cities, but yeah, I'd say it's London. Why is this difficult again to pinpoint without delving deeper into the research? But perhaps as it would exist across different landlords, is it the different expectations of tenants? I mean, tenants in London, more urban, which differs from, for instance, your rural landlords, who typically draw higher satisfaction. So again, it comes back to understanding about your tenant base, differences, different impacts that age, geographical location can have on the results, I think. But it is something that we have seen quite consistently, that London bias, which exists and which we must take into account.
Yeah, and it's just something I often see kind of popping up as being quite a stark difference. And that, as you mentioned in the presentation, it's worth taking that into account. I'll stick with you, Adam. I'll come to Claire and Fleur in a moment, because I've just got a couple of questions about the national tenant surveys as well that you mentioned. But just back with you, Adam, and then other panel members might want to pitch in as well. We've had a couple of questions that links back to the kind of change in expectations of customers over the last few years, particularly in terms of cost of living, which has had kind of the dual impact of potentially changing customer expectations, but also being a bit of a cost squeeze on organisations as well. And we've got a question around, is that kind of change in satisfaction levels, start with you, Adam, and then others may want to input into it as well, is that driven by change in expectations, or is it driven by changing kind of service standards? I don't know if there's views on that.
I don't think there's perhaps a clear line to draw, but I think it'll be a combination of all of them. Of course, expectations are changing. That's not least due to the cost of living. Also, the increased scrutiny on social landlords in the media, for instance, that changes expectations. Perhaps we expect more of our landlords, however unrealistic that may be, or realistic. Also expectations of, for instance, younger residents. So if we think about the environment which younger people have grown up in, with, for instance, Amazon and all of this fast pace of life, those are surely going to have an impact on, for instance, your expectation of how long something should take. So yeah, it's very multifold, and yeah.
And Anne-Marie, we're sort of seeing quite a lot of that, where organisations are saying customers are comparing their landlord service to Amazon and to other providers and other sets as well, which I imagine drives some of that customer engagement and perception stuff as well. Yeah,
and I think tenants have been rightly communicated with to say that they should expect more from their landlords. It's not an environment that we should, or a thing that we should shy away from. I think that that's probably been quite clear. And then that satisfaction should, it's almost a bit like the volume of complaints, where there's a massive discussion about we've got loads of complaints. Does that mean we're doing really badly? But in fact, it's good that tenants are actually engaging and telling us that they're not happy with what the landlord is providing. I do think there's some national picture stuff. I think that we've got housing stock that was in the main nationally built in the 1960s that in the main is reaching quite a lot of its end of life and in not particular good condition. And I think some of the solutions we've put in place as a sector to try and resolve those things haven't really cut it as well as we would have liked. So accommodation in itself is deteriorating. So that expectation and that will show over time, that quality of accommodation is dropping because homes are reaching, or buildings are reaching the ends of their life. So yeah, there's a lot of factors that affect that. But I think, yeah, it's right that if tenants should feel like they need more, but in that whole world of Amazon and digital, where we tend to deal with quite big organizations as individuals that have really slick products and really slick customer experiences, and then when you're dealing with a smaller housing association that maybe doesn't have that digital capability or doesn't have that responsiveness that we've become as a society quite used to, it does really affect that expectation piece. But yeah, it's a challenge, I think, but I don't think it's a bad thing that tenants are telling us that it's not good enough, because I think we'd question the whole purpose of all this effort if tenants were all happy.
And I think just to build on that point, Anne-Marie, I think there is an evident discrepancy between what providers might believe they're delivering and what tenants might expect. Personally, when I've spoken to tenants, I haven't heard that they expect Amazon levels of service delivery from their provider. What I've heard is that they expect a kind of timely repair service, or for complaints to be logged and dealt with appropriately. But it's worth noting, if we're thinking about triangulation with the TSMs, the Transparency, Influence and Accountability Standard includes requirements around publishing information for tenants, including things like service standards that they can expect. So you can marry up what tenants might be asking for versus what you're offering. And I think making clear the service that is available for tenants is going to help those conversations. We also have requirements about tenants having meaningful influence on service design and delivery. So where there's a mismatch in those expectations, there are provisions around how to kind of bridge that gap, perhaps. And then also requirements about publishing data, so tenants can see and hold the landlord to account on performance against those service standards. And I think all of those things were designed to kind of help these conversations happen.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Fleur, Claire, sticking with you two, you mentioned in the presentation around and you mentioned again just in some of the answers there, and the National Tenant Survey, which I think was announced, I'll get my dates wrong, 6-8 months ago, back in autumn time, but I haven't seen much about it. Just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that. How's it going to link into the TSMs? Is that something that you're going out to tenants across the sector? Is it going to be looking at similar measures as the TSMs? Are there thoughts available at the moment and what that will look like, what the timescales on that are, or is it a bit further off still?
So you're right. We announced this in September last year. We've commissioned a research agency to carry out the research. We're asking the same questions as the TSMs. And the idea is that we will have data back from tenants directly. So we're not using landlords as a conduit in this. Our research agency is contacting tenants directly, asking the same TSM questions to give us a benchmark that we can then use in the context of what the broader TSM data set tells us. And I think particularly thinking about things like how different levels of satisfaction are between different cohorts, different demographic groups of tenants. I don't know, Claire, if there's anything you want to add, but I think that's our...
No, I think that's, and I suppose the other thing is going back to that point about survey methodology, and we've touched on a TSM review. All of that will help inform that TSM review. So I think it's about us directly seeing some of these issues at play ourselves, and seeing, you know, that as we've talked about, sort of the London effect, and different levels of satisfaction between different demographies. So it's an opportunity for us to sort of get all of that information ourselves and use it, as Fleur said, both to sort of be able to compare against the sort of with the TSM's data that we're seeing that landlords have, but also just sort of being able to look ahead and consider, actually, does that mean we'll you know, we use that to inform, which I think we will use that to inform our TSM review.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And I guess it's part of that helpful kind of triangulation of an understanding, as well as what's going on. So more to come on that. Watch your space. I think the message is there, isn't it?
Yeah.
Just come back to again, Claire and Fleur as well. You talked a bit about in the presentation around kind of the and just a heads up to participants, do submit questions. We'll look to wrap up in sort of 5-10 minutes or so. So if there's any more questions, do put them through now. But just a couple of other questions just to run through, Claire and Fleur, to kick off with. And I go back to that point, really helpful reminder in the presentation from Claire and Fleur about it's not just about the outputs or the results of the TSM data, it's about how the organisation uses that. And this isn't the most open question, but I assume when you are looking at, as is everything with the regulator push at the moment, it's evolving. When you're looking at the TSM data, I assume you can be looking and asking questions around how are you using it, how have you triangulated it, what's the samples. You can be looking at the process as much as the basic outputs of the results, I assume.
So when we conduct our internal TSM review, the data will go through a process of cleansing, as you would expect, and then we'll move on to look at the issues of data quality. So where the sample size is correct, where we find issues around things like the sample size, or, you know, the data quality issues, will follow those up. We're also cross-referencing, was the correct survey used? Were the questions asked as exactly as worded as we've required? Was the response scale exactly the same? Was that used? So all of those issues are going to give us a picture around data quality, and we will follow those up in due course. Thinking about what they tell us about actual performance, where we see performance reports that indicate where providers are giving us information that their performance is potentially a risk to tenants, so think about safety and quality, we'll absolutely follow up on those. And then the TSMs are really intended as well that as part of our planned or responsive engagement, so part of our inspections, we can take a closer look at things like board assurance, the things I mentioned in the slide, so board assurance that the process was done correctly, and then how the TSM data is being used to inform service design delivery, meet the rest of the required outcomes in our standards.
Yeah, that's helpful. Fleur, anything to add on top?
I think just that point about risk-based, really, I think it's very much, as Fleur said, looking at the sort of areas that will be sort of concerned around will be around those sort of higher risk areas in terms of health and safety to tenants, or more vulnerable tenants in particular. Yeah,
sure. That's helpful. And you mentioned about the kind of TSMs reviewing them and speak through this process, reviewing them. Again, is that kind of a, we'll see what happens kind of next with that sort of thing? Have you got thoughts on it? Because I'm sure providers will be thinking, oh, we'll just get our hands around the current mix of them. Is it going to be different? Are you still working through that? Maybe have you got any hints or tips or what might come next on that?
It will be a little way off. So I think what we certainly don't want is landlords to think that we're suddenly going to keep changing on a yearly basis. We committed, I think, in the decision statement that we would review the tenant satisfaction measures at an appropriate point, but we're very aware that they need to be embedded. You know, we haven't even, large providers haven't even, you know, the chance to, been able to submit yet. So, we're looking at a little way off really before, because I think it's important for us to be able to get at least 1 year's set of data, if not more, to be able to really look at that data and what it's telling us. And as Fleur's pointed out, there may be other changes needed to some of the tenant satisfaction measures, you know, for example, electrical safety, where, you know, those, we know that landlords will have to make changes to their systems or whatever and add that into their TSM data. So we wouldn't give a date at the moment, and I think we've said sort of it'll be a little way off.
Great, that's helpful. Lovely. Right. So I think we've come to the end of kind of the questions from the participants. Thank you for the questions. So I will probably wrap things up now, but only for me left to say thank you, massive thank you to Adam, Fleur, Claire, and Anne-Marie as well for putting in the work for the presentations. Really excellent presentations, some great insight, great discussion around some of the topics there around some of the bias, the London factor, but also some of the bits around kind of how the TSM data will be used going forward in a regulated context. Hope participants have enjoyed the session. As a reminder, we've recorded the sessions. We'll make the recording available. We'll also be sending an email out with details on kind of contact details, follow up on more specific questions. But thank you to everybody and enjoy the rest of the day.